At Easter dinner, my brother laughed and said, "Not everyone can handle real tech." Everyone chuckled except my grandma. Then she dropped one sentence that changed everything. "Stay with me because this isn't just about ego or family drama, this is about reclaiming your worth when no one's listening." At 32, Lindsay Hayes had built a career most people would envy. She oversaw strategic acquisitions at one of the largest enterprise software companies in the Pacific Northwest, managed a high-performing team, and made decisions that moved millions of dollars. But if you asked her family what she did, they'd probably say something vague, something about marketing or business stuff, and then quickly pivot to talk about her younger brother Jake. Lindsay had never corrected them. Not really. Over time, it had simply become easier to stay quiet, to let them assume, to disappear behind the narrative that had always cast her as the supporting character in Jake's story. The Hayes family lived in a modest, well-kept home in the suburbs of Portland, where the lawn was trimmed just right and the neighbors waved politely on trash day. Richard, their father, had been an accountant for 30 years and still couldn't figure out how to reset the Wi-Fi router without calling Jake. Their mother, Claire, a high school English teacher, had long since surrendered any claim to technological literacy. For them, Jake was nothing short of a marvel, coding his own games by age 11, taking apart computers just to rebuild them better, winning science fairs before most kids figured out how to spell algorithm. Lindsay, in contrast, had been the organized one, the helpful daughter who kept the household calendar updated and made honor roll year after year without anyone really noticing. When Jake won a robotics competition, the family threw a party. When Lindsay was elected student body president, her mother said, "That's nice, dear," and went back to grading essays. From the outside, their family looked balanced, even warm. But for Lindsay, growing up with Jake was like orbiting a star that burned too bright. No matter what she achieved, it always seemed to pale in comparison. If she got an A, Jake got an A+ and built a model of the solar system in his spare time. If she won a debate, Jake casually mentioned he'd been invited to join a summer program at MIT. She used to think the comparisons would stop once they became adults. They didn't. The subtle, unspoken hierarchy remained. Even now, with her career soaring, Lindsay still felt like she was fighting for recognition in a family that had long ago decided who the star was. Her parents didn't mean harm, she knew. They weren't cruel, just conditioned. Conditioned to expect brilliance from Jake and responsibility from her. To them, it made perfect sense that Lindsay was stable and reliable while Jake was brilliant and visionary. Those were the roles they had silently assigned their children long ago, and roles, as Lindsay had learned, were hard to rewrite. The only person who had ever truly seen her outside those roles was her grandmother, Edna. At 78, Edna was a force of nature, sharp, curious, and fiercely independent. She'd been a mathematics professor in the 1970s, one of the few women in her field at the time, and she had never lost her edge. Unlike the rest of the family, Edna didn't fawn over Jake or dismiss Lindsay's work. She asked real questions. She listened. She saw. "You see systems, not just tasks," Edna once told her when Lindsay was still in college. "That's rare. Don't let anyone convince you that your gift is smaller just because it's quieter." It was a conversation that Lindsay often replayed on the hard days, the days when her work was ignored in family group texts, or when Jake bragged about his latest venture and no one asked what she'd been up to. Those days still came more often than she liked to admit. In college, Lindsay had chosen business not because she lacked ambition, but because she was drawn to strategy, to structure, to building solutions that worked beyond code. Yet even then, Jake's words lingered, so. Spreadsheets and presentations. Cool, I guess. Not everyone's cut out for real tech. She had smiled and swallowed the sting. Over time, Lindsay learned to turn that sting into fuel. She studied harder, worked longer, taught herself enough programming to hold her own in technical meetings, not to compete with Jake, but so no one could dismiss her as just another marketing girl. She became fluent in both languages, people and product, business and technology. And still she said nothing at family dinners. What would be the point? She knew how the story went. Jake was the innovator. Lindsay was the sister who kept things organized. It had become the family's favorite fable, retold year after year, with minor updates but the same ending. Every Thanksgiving or birthday dinner played out like a well-rehearsed script. Jake would command the room with stories of his latest project, complete with acronyms and technical jargon that made everyone nod in awe. Their parents would beam with pride, even when they didn't understand a word he said. And Lindsay. She would smile, pass the salad, and keep her success tucked safely away like a secret. Edna, though, always met her eyes across the table. A subtle wink. A raised brow. A silent reminder. Your time will come. Lindsay wasn't sure she believed that anymore. But she held on to the possibility, not out of bitterness but out of hope. Because somewhere deep down, despite everything, she still longed to be truly seen by the people she loved. Not as the responsible sister or the support act in Jake's show, but as herself. A woman with vision, with depth, with power. Quiet power perhaps, but power nonetheless. Lindsay chose business school not because it was easy, but because it made sense. She had always been drawn to patterns, how decisions affected outcomes, how people moved within systems, how influence could be built quietly, not just asserted loudly. Strategy fascinated her not just in theory, but in practice. While Jake dove headfirst into engineering at Stanford, basking in the prestige and intensity of his computer science courses, Lindsay enrolled at the University of Washington with a focus in business analytics and organizational leadership. It was the kind of program that didn't get headlines but created the people who actually made companies run. When she shared her decision with Jake over winter break, he raised an eyebrow, leaned back in his chair, and offered a smirk that still made her stomach knot when she remembered it. Business, huh, he'd said, tapping his fingers on the table like a metronome of disapproval. So basically, you'll be making PowerPoints and color-coded spreadsheets about products you don't really understand. That's cute. The word cute hung in the air like a slap. Her parents hadn't said anything, Dad had chuckled softly, Mom looked vaguely amused, and Lindsay had excused herself to the kitchen under the pretense of needing more coffee. But it stayed with her. It always stayed. Jake's words had a way of becoming invisible ink in the margins of her life, flaring up under pressure and doubt. Still, Lindsay didn't confront him. She never had. Instead, she went back to school and did what she always did. She worked hard. She immersed herself in classes on market behavior, project management, behavioral economics. She joined the university's entrepreneurship incubator not to pitch an idea but to understand how ideas were shaped, funded, scaled. Her professors praised her for her grasp of macro-level decision-making, her uncanny ability to map out the long game. But something still gnawed at her, something Jake had planted. The unspoken implication that she wasn't really in tech, that without knowing how to build the machine she couldn't possibly understand its purpose. And that implication was echoed everywhere in internship interviews where male candidates were praised for technical chops, in classrooms where girls were still interrupted more often than boys, even in team projects where she was quietly asked to just handle the slides. Lindsay didn't need to code to succeed, but she needed to understand enough to be taken seriously. So she started learning. Quietly on her own after classes and work-study shifts. She downloaded tutorials, subscribed to online programming courses, and began building rudimentary Python projects from scratch. HTML, CSS, JavaScript, slowly line by line she began decoding the language of the world Jake had used to shut her out. It was excruciating at first. Nothing came easily. She wasn't a natural programmer, her brain didn't fire in logic puzzles the way Jake's did. But she was persistent. And persistence, as it turned out, was a skill just as powerful as raw talent. While her classmates partied on weekends or relaxed between exams, Lindsay stayed up late in the communal study lounge, hoodie, pulled tight earbuds in, staring at cascading lines of code and error messages that felt like riddles she was born to solve. No fanfare. No audience. Just grit. The only person who seemed to notice was Ethan. They'd met in their junior year when she spilled tea on his notebook in the campus cafe. He was a history major, with sharp eyes, quiet confidence, and a sense of humor that gently chipped away at her defenses. They started studying together, then dating, then sharing pieces of their lives in that tentative way you do when you're still figuring out if it's real. Ethan didn't understand coding, but he understood her. He never once asked why she pushed herself so hard, but he always brought her coffee before her late-night study sessions. When she doubted herself, he reminded her of the way she saw connections others missed. When she failed, because yes, she failed often in those early coding attempts, he never saw it as defeat-only process. "You're building a bridge," he told her once when she confessed how overwhelming it all felt. "One piece at a time. And you'll cross it when you're ready." With him, Lindsay didn't feel like she had to prove anything. And that freedom, rare and radiant, only made her more determined. She didn't need to become a software engineer. She didn't want to. But she wanted to speak the language. She wanted to walk into a boardroom or a product sprint and hold her ground, not by parroting jargon but by truly understanding the mechanics beneath the surface. She didn't want to be in the background anymore. Not in her career, not in her family, not in her own life. It took her 2 years to reach the level where she could confidently sit in on technical meetings without feeling like an imposter. By the time she graduated, Lindsay had completed a capstone project that integrated user experience metrics with back-end data analytics, a hybrid approach that caught the attention of DG Path, a growing B2B tech company in Seattle. She got the offer 2 weeks before graduation. It wasn't glamorous. The title was Modest Junior Marketing Associate and the pay was average. But it was a foot in the right door, one with product teams and developers and an environment where she could apply everything she'd taught herself. Jake didn't ask about the job. At the family barbecue that summer, he barely looked up from his phone when she mentioned her new role. "Marketing," he said. "Nice. Hope they let you design the swag bags." And again, Lindsay said nothing. Not because she had nothing to say, but because her words were meant for bigger rooms. She didn't need to fight Jake for attention anymore. She would earn her space where it counted. And slowly, silently, that's exactly what she began to do. 10 years. That's how long it took Lindsay to climb from a junior marketing associate to director of strategic acquisitions at SynergyWorks. 10 years of working harder, longer, smarter than anyone around her. 10 years of learning how to navigate boardrooms full of men who barely looked up when she entered. 10 years of building not just a resume but a reputation, one defined not by titles or ego but by results. And yet, back at home at family dinners and holiday gatherings, she remained invisible. They still thought she worked in marketing. Not in the dismissive way some strangers might say it, but in the way that made it sound like she handed out samples at trade shows or scheduled tweets for product launches. Even when she tried to explain briefly, humbly, they nodded, smiled, and pivoted to the next round of Jake's triumphs. His latest startup had just closed a seed round. His latest tech piece had been published on some industry blog. His latest product demo had gone viral at a conference. There was always a new chapter in the gospel of Jake, and Lindsay had long since accepted her role in the pews, not the pulpit. She never corrected them. Not because she was ashamed, far from it, but because the effort felt like yelling into the wind. Besides, if she'd said, "I oversee multi-million-dollar tech acquisitions for one of the most competitive firms in the industry," someone would have made a joke. Something about her finally doing something important, or maybe a dig about how Jake must have rubbed off on her. She could already hear her uncle's laugh, her cousin's smirk, her dad's absent-minded nod. So she stayed quiet. She let them believe what they wanted to believe. Until that night. It was a birthday dinner for their mother Claire's 65th, and the extended family had gathered at a bistro downtown that Lindsay had recommended. It had a private room in the back and just enough ambient noise to drown out awkward silences, which she assumed would be abundant. But the room had been loud, very loud, with Jake's voice dominating the space. He sat at the head of the long table, flanked by Heather, his ever-gracious wife, and their father, who leaned in with rapt attention as Jake discussed something about machine learning models and venture scaling. Lindsay sat 3 seats away next to her cousin's husband, who was kind enough but kept asking if her job involved Instagram influencers. She smiled politely, corrected him twice, and then gave up. Her wine glass emptied faster than she'd intended. So Lindsay, Uncle Don eventually piped up, slapping his napkin on his knee. "Still doing that marketing thing?" She opened her mouth to answer, but Jake beat her to it. "Yeah," he said, not looking up from his plate, "she's at SynergyWorks. You know, that big corporate place downtown. I think she leads like branding or something." Lindsay blinked. The room had gone just quiet enough to make the exchange audible. Her face flushed not with embarrassment but with something deeper. Something heavier. Actually, she said carefully, I'm Director of Strategic Acquisitions. Oh, Jake teased, dragging the sound out like a teacher praising a toddler for saying astronaut. Fancy. Someone laughed. It might have been Uncle Don. Or her cousin. Or no one. The sound blurred. So what is that? Another voice asked. Like, figuring out which companies to put ads on. Lindsay stared at her plate. The air around her felt thick. It means, she said slowly, that I lead a team responsible for identifying and acquiring smaller tech companies that fit our long-term innovation and growth strategy. A beat. Then, so, you buy companies. Among other things, yes. Jake chuckled. Just don't buy mine, okay? Another laugh. Louder this time. Lindsay stood up. She didn't remember picking up her purse. Didn't remember saying goodbye. She remembered the waiter's puzzled glance as she walked out. She remembered the night air hitting her skin like cold reality. She remembered texting Ethan, I left. Please don't ask. It wasn't until she got home that the tears came, hot, silent, and not entirely from pain. There was rage in them too. Rage at how small her family made her feel. Rage at how she kept letting them. Rage at the years spent proving herself in rooms filled with strangers only to crumble in a room full of people who were supposed to love her. The next morning she called Grandma Edna. The older woman answered on the third ring. I was wondering when you'd call, she said without greeting. Lindsay managed a watery laugh. You heard? Of course I heard. Your mother called me thinking I'd have something nice to say about Jake's Toastmaster performance. I didn't. There was a pause. Then Lindsay whispered, why does it still hurt? Because Edna replied gently, you're human, and humans want to be seen. Especially by their families. I'm so tired of being invisible. You're not invisible, Lindsay. You're just not loud. There's a difference. Another pause. Then I wish I could be louder. Edna didn't speak right away. When she did, her voice was calm but fierce. Sweetheart, you don't need to shout to be heard. But you do need to stop whispering to yourself. You've worked your way into a place of power earned, not given, and you keep acting like it's some kind of fluke. It's not. You are brilliant, strategic, and damn good at what you do. I don't know how to make them see it. Maybe they never will, Edna said bluntly. But that doesn't change the truth, and the truth is your light is real. Whether they look at it or not. So don't dim it for anyone, not Jake, not your father. Not even your mother. Shine anyway. Lindsay wiped her eyes. You don't need to prove anything, baby, Edna added. But don't you ever let anyone smother your flame, not even for peace. It was the kind of statement that stuck in your bones. That lived in your chest long after the call ended. Lindsay didn't go to the next family brunch. She didn't explain. She didn't justify. She just got up the next morning and went to work, head high, back straight, heart still raw but steadier. Because for once she wasn't shrinking to fit their view of her. She was holding space for herself. It started like any other quarterly strategy meeting, coffee still too bitter, lights too bright, and the air sharp with ambition. Lindsay sat at the head of the conference table, surrounded by her team of analysts, market researchers, and financial strategists. As Director of Strategic Acquisitions, this was her battlefield. Not boardrooms full of noise and ego, but calm, methodical decision-making. No pitch decks, no grandstanding. Just data models and intuition sharpened by years of navigating uncertainty. Her assistant Parker slid a binder across the polished table. This quarter's shortlist, he said. 15 emerging companies tiered by innovation, potential IP value, and synergy compatibility. We did a deeper dive into 6. Lindsay flipped open the binder without looking up. Her fingers moved automatically, scanning for the highlights: market position, tech differentiators, burn rate, team maturity, potential cultural fit. Her eyes halted halfway down the second page. Neuralink, she asked, voice tighter than she intended. Yeah, Parker said, oblivious to the tremor in her tone. Really promising tech. Advanced AI language mapping, edge processing models, early signs of enterprise application viability. But they're bleeding cash. Zero go-to-market strategy. might not last 6 months without intervention. Lindsay kept her face neutral. Her stomach, however, dropped like a stone. She stared at the name again. Neuralink. Founder Jake Hayes. It was surreal seeing her younger brother's company appear not as a boast at the family table, but as a line item on a spreadsheet marked high innovation risk. The analysis was clinical, detached, brutally honest. Lindsay didn't need to read the fine print to know it was accurate. She'd always known Jake was brilliant, but brilliance was not the same as leadership. It wasn't even the same as vision. Jake could build extraordinary things, but he had never shown the patience to scale them nor the humility to ask for help when his ambition outpaced his planning. She flipped through the report page by page, each paragraph cutting deeper than the last. Neuralink's product had potential. Its technical infrastructure was solid. The underlying AI model was actually impressive even in comparison to other competitors in the same vertical. But everything else? A disaster. No CFO, no cohesive team culture, no strategic roadmap. Their customer acquisition cost was astronomical. Their churn rate even worse. Lindsay didn't need a background in finance to see what was happening. She needed only to remember every dinner where Jake dismissed marketing as fluff, every time he bragged about disrupting an industry while ignoring how industries actually worked. She closed the binder slowly. Her instinct was to recuse herself immediately. She had done it once before years ago when a former colleague's startup came under review. It was protocol and it protected the integrity of the process. But before she could speak, Monica Reynolds, the firm's VP of corporate strategy, addressed her directly. Lindsay, before you bow out of this one, I'd like your take. Not as a decision maker, just as a strategic advisor. Lindsay hesitated. I have a personal connection to the founder. Monica nodded. We figured. But you know this sector better than anyone in the room. And frankly, you have the cleanest lens when it comes to assessing if this tech has a place here. Just advise. We'll keep it documented. Lindsay wanted to say no. She wanted to run. But something in her, the part that had spent a decade becoming someone who saw the whole board, wouldn't let her. This wasn't about Jake. It was about whether Neuralink, despite its mess, could bring real value. So she agreed. Quietly. Professionally. And then, after the room cleared out, she stayed behind and read the report again. Line by line, it was all there. The innovation was real. Jake had built something with teeth. But the foundation was crumbling underneath him. The projections were built on ego, not evidence. The internal communications were a mess, engineering in silos, no coordination with user experience, no customer success team. Lindsay recognized the classic mistake of gifted builders mistaking technology for strategy, talent for leadership. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the binder. Jake would never admit it, but this company, his pride, his proof of genius, was sinking. And unless someone intervened, unless someone with structure and discipline stepped in, Neuralink would fold quietly. No IPO. No acquisition headlines. Just another failed startup in a crowded market. For a moment, she let herself imagine the headlines Jake probably hoped for. She could even picture his LinkedIn post. After much consideration, I've chosen to strategically align Neuralink with SynergyWorks to accelerate our mutual vision. The language of pride wrapped around the reality of rescue. But here in this room, Lindsay saw the truth. She wasn't here to hurt Jake. She wasn't even here to save him. She was here because her job was to see what others missed. And that included watching someone who had never once taken her seriously nearly sabotage his own creation out of arrogance. She sighed and made her notes. It wasn't personal. Not yet. But it was sobering how easily ego could ruin even the most promising work. Jake wasn't a villain. He was just one more talented man who thought having the loudest voice in the room meant he knew everything worth knowing. And she, quiet, strategic, never once needing to raise her voice, was now the person deciding whether his company lived or died. The irony would have been poetic if it weren't so sad. Easter Sunday at the Hayes household looked like something from a lifestyle magazine: polished silverware, pastel linens, deviled eggs arranged like jewels on a ceramic platter, and a honey-glazed ham that shimmered in the center of the sile table. But for Lindsay, the scene might as well have been a battleground. The war wasn't loud or obvious, there were no raised voices, no slammed doors. The weapon of choice here was narrative. And once again, Jake was winning. He sat at the head of the table, animated and charismatic, spinning tales of entrepreneurial grit and genius. "You have to know when to make your move," he said, cutting into his ham with surgical confidence. "In this industry, timing is everything. That's why I executed the exit when I did." Strategic alignment, market positioning, it was all part of the long-term play. Their parents beamed, drinking in every word like it was scripture. Even Heather, his wife, smiled politely, though Lindsay noticed the strain in her expression. Ethan squeezed her hand gently under the table, his way of reminding her she didn't have to respond, not yet. Lindsay remained silent, calmly passing dishes and exchanging small talk with her aunt and cousin while Jake strutted through his performance. It was exactly what she had expected. He had turned the sale of Neuralink, an acquisition that had saved his company from collapse, into a masterpiece of self-mythology. In his version, he hadn't been rescued. He'd orchestrated it all. The tech visionary who'd gracefully transitioned out at the peak of success. Not a word about missed payrolls. Not a whisper about the burn rate that had sent red flags up across SynergyWorks dashboards. Not a mention of the fact that the company who'd acquired him, who had made sure his engineers kept their jobs, his IP found a future, and his own name stayed clean, was the same one Lindsay worked for. And had evaluated. And had quietly advocated to save. She said nothing. Until Edna, seated at the far end of the table with perfect posture and eyes that saw everything, gently tapped her glass. "You know," she said with a thoughtful lilt, "I was reading something about SynergyWorks last week. They've been making some very smart acquisitions lately. Including a little AI company, Neuralink, I believe. That's the one you founded, isn't it, Jake?" Jake's fork paused midair. He smiled, a tight, flickering thing. "Yes, Grandma," he said. "That's the one. Brilliant piece of tech. They were lucky to get it." Edna nodded slowly. "And Lindsay," she continued, turning her gaze with all the softness of a sunbeam and the weight of a judge. "Don't you work at SynergyWorks?" The room stilled. You could hear the clink of a water glass setting down at the far end of the table. Jake's head snapped toward her. "She's in marketing," he said quickly, dismissively, the familiar edge of condescension sliding into his voice. "Makes brochures and event plans. Good ones, I'm sure." A ripple of awkward laughter tried and failed to lift the tension. Lindsay set down her fork. Slowly, deliberately. "Actually," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I'm Director of Strategic Acquisitions. My team led the evaluation of Neuralink before the deal went through." For a moment, no one moved. Jake stared at her, blinking. "No," he said flatly. "That's not possible. I would have known." "Would you?" she asked, folding her napkin. "You didn't even know what I did." "We never dealt with you directly," he said, scrambling, now defensive. "I worked with executives from my team," she finished for him. "I recused myself from negotiations due to conflict of interest. But I was the one who identified Neuralink as an acquisition target. I reviewed the initial reports, and I advised on the due diligence findings." Silence. Heather looked down. Their mother looked back and forth between her children, confused. Their father's brow furrowed, struggling to absorb the reality. Edna, bless her, simply sipped her tea. Jake shook his head, a bitter smile spreading. "So this is what this is about," he said. "You couldn't stand me getting credit for something, so you swooped in to take the win." "This isn't a competition," Lindsay replied. "This is reality. Your company was 3 months from insolvency. You had groundbreaking tech and no idea how to scale it. You needed structure, direction, and capital. SynergyWorks gave you all 3. You're unbelievable," Jake snapped. "You think reading a few spreadsheets makes you the hero. I think seeing the whole picture is my job," she said, her voice still even. "And you've spent your entire career mocking the parts you didn't understand. Marketing, strategy, operations. But those are the things that saved you." Jake stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous." "Sit down, Edna," said her voice, soft but commanding. Jake froze. He looked at his grandmother, startled. "Sit down," she repeated. And he did. Slowly. Reluctantly. "No one's here to humiliate you," she continued. "But it's time we stopped pretending that one kind of brilliance matters more than another. Your sister didn't embarrass you. She protected your legacy even when you didn't know it, and if you can't see that, then you don't deserve what she gave you." Jake said nothing. No one did. The tension hung heavy, but something had shifted. The truth was in the open now. Not shouted, but standing tall nonetheless. Lindsay reached for her water. Her hands didn't tremble. For once, she didn't feel like she was fighting for oxygen in a room too full of Jake's voice. She had said what mattered, and that finally was enough. The front door slammed with a finality that shook the entire table. Jake was gone. No parting shot, no dramatic apology. Just the echo of his anger trailing into the quiet suburbs. For a few seconds, no one moved. The air had become thick with the weight of truths finally spoken, the fragile scaffolding of family illusion crumbling into silence. Edna looked down at her teacup. Lindsay stared at the last untouched slice of ham on her plate. Her mother twisted her cloth napkin between her fingers. Her father looked stunned, like he was watching a storm he hadn't seen coming, even though the sky had been rumbling for years. It was Heather who finally broke the silence. "I think maybe he needed to hear it," she said softly, her voice trembling. All eyes turned to her. Heather, who had smiled through every dinner, nodded through every one of Jake's monologues. Heather, who rarely spoke unless it was to gently steer a conversation or soothe someone else's discomfort. She took a deep breath, then looked straight at Lindsay. "You saved us," she said. "You saved him. And he's too proud to say it, but I'm not." The words struck Lindsay like a quiet wave, unexpected, steady, and warm. Neuralink was drowning. Heather continued, her voice barely above a whisper now. "We were 3 missed payrolls away from collapse. Jake didn't want to admit it, but he couldn't sleep. We took a second mortgage on the house. I offered to sell my car, and he wouldn't even talk about it. He just kept saying the next funding round would solve everything." She paused. When the offer from SynergyWorks came through, it was like someone opened a window in a burning room. We could breathe again. Lindsay sat motionless, stunned. She had known the company was in trouble, had read the data, the financials, the trend lines. But hearing it aloud, not from an analyst or a spreadsheet, but from the woman who had lived it, sacrificed for it, made it real in a different way. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, her throat tightening. Heather turned to Lindsay's parents. "I know Jake can be," she hesitated, "loud and self-assured and hard to reach, but he's not a bad man. He just has trouble when things don't go according to the story he tells himself. And in his story, he was always the one leading the charge. The genius. The provider. Losing control, needing help felt like failure to him." She paused again. But Lindsay. She didn't just help, she made sure he didn't fall apart in front of everyone. She protected him. Her voice broke on that last word. Their mother looked stricken. Her eyes darted between Heather and Lindsay like someone watching a film but only just now realizing who the main character was. "Sweetheart," she said softly to Lindsay, "why didn't you ever tell us?" Her voice was full of a kind of quiet grief, not just for what had happened tonight, but for all the years before it. Lindsay breathed in slowly. "Because you never asked," she said, not with bitterness but with a clarity that was almost gentle. "I tried once or twice, but Jake was always the star of the conversation. And after a while I just stopped trying to compete." "But we didn't mean to overlook," your father said, brows furrowed. "We just assumed. You assumed that because I wasn't loud I wasn't doing anything worth noticing." Lindsay replied. "That because I didn't brag or make a scene I must be fine in the background." Her mother looked down. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I think we just got used to Jake being the one who needed the spotlight. And we didn't realize how much we were missing." "It's okay," Lindsay said, though the words felt both true and not true at the same time. She was okay eventually, but there had been years when she hadn't been. Years of swallowing disappointment, of shrinking herself to fit the mold of the quiet, reliable sibling. Years of building a life in silence because no one had made space to hear about it. The pain was old, but it still stung when exposed to air. "I used to think," Lindsay continued, "that if I just worked hard enough, you'd eventually see me. Not just look at me, but see me. For who I am. For what I've built." But I've realized something: I don't need validation from anyone else to know what I'm worth. I know now. I know I'm not small. I'm not the background character in someone else's success story. I'm the architect of my own. The room was quiet again. But this time it wasn't uncomfortable, it was reverent. Heather reached across the table and touched Lindsay's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Really?" Lindsay gave a small smile. "You're welcome. And thank you for being honest." Their father cleared his throat. "I want to learn more. About what you do. About how you got here. I feel like I've missed the whole story." "You still have time," Edna said, her voice as steady as always. "If you're willing to listen." He nodded. Lindsay looked around at the faces of her family, stunned, humbled, maybe even changed, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel: release. The wound of invisibility didn't vanish, but it no longer festered in the dark. It had been aired. Acknowledged. And somehow in that truth there was healing. She found him on the front porch, hunched over with his elbows on his knees, staring out at the quiet street like he was watching a world he no longer belonged to. The sky had dimmed, fading from spring blue to a soft gray, and a breeze swept loose petals from the dogwood trees down onto the walkway. Jake didn't look up when she stepped outside. He didn't have to. He knew it would be her. Lindsay sat beside him, keeping a small space between them. For a moment, neither spoke. It wasn't awkward, it was tentative. Fragile. Like they were balancing on the edge of something important. "You came out here to gloat," he said finally, his voice flat, brittle. "No," she replied. "I came to talk." "What's there to talk about? You won. You finally proved you were smarter than me." She shook her head. "This isn't about winning." He let out a humorless laugh. "Easy for you to say. You've got the job, the respect, the control. You walked into the same boardroom that swallowed me whole and made it yours." She turned slightly toward him. "You really think that's what this is about? You think I did all of this, worked for years, built a career, made tough calls just to get even with you? Didn't you?" he asked, but his tone lacked conviction. "No, Jake," she said softly. "I didn't do it because of you. I did it in spite of you." The words hung in the air. Not cruel. Just true. He looked down at his hands, fingers threaded together like he was holding something that might break. "I don't know who I am if I'm not the genius," he said finally. "That was the only thing I ever had. The only thing anyone ever noticed." Lindsay's chest tightened, not with anger, with something closer to grief. She had spent so many years resenting him, building walls to protect herself from his dismissiveness, his arrogance. But now here he was, cracked open, raw, and disarmed in a way she had never seen. "You don't have to be the genius to be worthy, Jake," she said. "You don't have to be the best in the room to matter." He turned to her, then, eyes searching. "But if I'm not exceptional, then what am I?" She paused. "You're the person you could have been all along if you weren't so busy trying to be better than everyone else." The answer hit him harder than she expected. He flinched just slightly and looked away. "Do you know what it was like?" he asked, voice low. "Being the one everyone looked to. The one they bragged about. It felt like I couldn't stop or breathe or doubt myself for even a second. Because if I did, maybe I'd disappear. Maybe I'd be just like everyone else." Lindsay nodded. "I know. Because while you were under that spotlight, I was outside of it, trying to be seen at all." They sat with that for a while. Two sides of the same wound. One child taught to shine or disappear, the other taught to stay small and polite. "You know," he said after a pause, "when they talked about the acquisition, I thought it would ruin me. Like I had failed. Like everything I built was being taken from me." "No one took it from you," she said. "We kept it alive. Because it mattered. Because you mattered. You could have told them. At dinner. That you were involved from the start. You could have humiliated me. That's never what I wanted," she said. "Not once." Jake's shoulders sagged. "You could have let it fail." "I know." He looked at her again, but this time there was something different in his eyes. Not pride, not defensiveness, just understanding. "Why did you help?" She answered honestly. "Because I saw something worth saving. The tech. The people. Even you. Jake. Especially you." Silence stretched again. A few cars passed. Somewhere, a neighbor's wind chimes picked up in the breeze. Then Jake said, "Do you ever think about how it could have been different?" She nodded. "All the time. We could have been partners instead of opponents. We could have learned from each other." "You still think that's possible?" "If we choose it, yes." He leaned back against the porch column, exhaling. "I don't know how to start over." "You don't have to start over," she said. "Just start honest." Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he offered her a sideways glance. "You're a better strategist than I gave you credit for." "You're not bad at building things," she replied. "You just need to build with people, not around them." He gave a faint smile. "Do you think they'll ever see me differently?" "They might," she said. "But the more important question is, will you?" He looked down, let the words sink, and then gave a small nod. "You think there's still a place for me at SynergyWorks?" "I know there is, but it won't look the same. You won't be the guy calling all the shots. You'll be part of a team." "You think I can do that?" She looked at him, truly looked. "Yes. If you're willing to learn." Jake leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees again. "I've spent so long trying not to be less that I forgot how to be more in the ways that actually matter." "You're not alone in that," she said. "But now you get to rewrite the story." "We both do." They sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was a kind of peace, uneasy maybe, but real. The first peace they'd had in years, not because everything was resolved, but because they had finally stopped performing, stopped hiding, and started telling the truth. 3 weeks after Easter dinner, Jake walked through the glass doors of SynergyWorks, not as a founder pitching his vision, but as a technical advisor trying to find his place in someone else's. In Lindsay's company. He didn't say much on his first day. He showed up early, wore a crisp button-down, and kept his shoulders straighter than usual, as if willing himself into humility. Lindsay watched from a distance, quietly alert, unsure whether this collaboration would heal old wounds or simply resurface them in new costumes. His official role was limited consulting on how Neuralink's technology could be integrated into SynergyWorks' existing infrastructure, providing insight to the data science team, and working alongside Marcus, the head of technical integration. Lindsay made it a point to not hover. She'd done her part, gotten him through the door, vouched for the value of his work, shielded him from the shame of failure. Now it was up to him. To her surprise, Jake adapted. Slowly, awkwardly, but earnestly. He began attending team syncs, asking questions instead of dominating conversations. He reviewed feedback without argument. Sometimes he even admitted when he didn't know something. And when Lindsay did cross paths with him in the cafeteria or hallway, the interactions were human, unforced. Tentative, yes, but without the sharp edges that once defined them. On the second Friday of his onboarding month, Lindsay walked into the integration lab and found Jake at the whiteboard sketching out a revised data pipeline for the language model. One of the engineers, Rachel, a quiet genius with no tolerance for tech bro nonsense, was nodding along, genuinely engaged. This restructure would cut latency by nearly 40%, Jake was saying, tapping the final node. "We'll need input from analytics to confirm the user impact, but the architecture's sound." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "We'll need project buy-in across 3 departments. But it's smart." "You think the system can handle the migration load?" Jake turned, almost smiling. "If we stagger it." "I already looped in IT." Lindsay stepped back unseen, a strange warmth rising in her chest. This wasn't the Jake she had grown up with. This was someone who had finally begun to value not just being brilliant, but being useful. 2 weeks later, their parents came to visit. It wasn't an official tour, just a quiet morning visit prompted by their father's tentative. "We'd like to understand what you both actually do." Lindsay had arranged a soft agenda, coffee in the atrium, a walkthrough of the innovation wing, a peek into the strategy room. She didn't expect much. She had learned not to. But when her mother walked into the open plan leadership floor and saw Lindsay standing in front of a team of analysts directing a conversation with clarity and purpose, something shifted. It was in her eyes. Not confusion. Not polite interest. Something closer to awe. Lindsay didn't even realize Jake had drifted to their side until he spoke. "This is where the real magic happens," he said, nodding toward the glass-walled strategy pod. Everyone talks about the tech, the code, the models, the product. But if you don't have someone who knows how to translate that into vision, it all falls apart. He paused, then added voice, lower but sincere. She's the one who knows how to keep things from falling apart. Their father looked over at Lindsay stunned. You manage all this. Lindsay smiled. I manage the part that makes everything else make sense. Jake chuckled, nudging their dad gently. Told you, she's the architect. I just write elegant functions. For the first time in her adult life, Lindsay saw her father's eyes well up, not with confusion or worry, but with pride. Real unmistakable pride. It was disorienting. And healing. They walked past the Neuralink integration suite where Jake casually explained the language model reconfigurations. Their mom nodded, not pretending to understand the details but listening intently. And who came up with the idea to fold it into this platform, she asked. That was Lindsay, Jake said without hesitation. She identified the value before anyone else did. He said it without irony. Without qualifiers. Just truth. Later that afternoon, as they sat on a quiet bench near the company garden, an odd little nook with succulents and steel sculptures, Jake looked over at her. You know, he said, I used to think the hardest thing was getting people to notice you. But I think the real work is making yourself worthy of being noticed. She tilted her head. You were always worthy, Jake. You just thought you had to perform for it. He exhaled. And you were always performing less so I could shine brighter. She looked out at the garden path winding around the trees. Maybe. But that's over now. Yeah, he said. It is. That evening, as she stood in her office looking down at the cityscape, Lindsay allowed herself a quiet smile. Not a victorious one, not a smug one. But the kind of smile you give yourself when years of invisible labor, emotional, professional, internal, finally start to reshape the world around you. She had not sought revenge. She had offered understanding. And in return, she'd been seen. Not just by Jake, but by everyone who once overlooked her light. The invitation arrived on a pale blue card handwritten in her mother's careful cursive dinner at home. Just us. To celebrate you both. Lindsay read it twice, not because she didn't understand, but because it didn't feel real. There had never been a dinner for her. Not one that didn't also include Jake's awards, Jake's launches, Jake's latest genius endeavor. But here it was. A quiet offering. An olive branch in ink. The dining room looked different that evening. Not in any physical way, same old oak table, same mismatched chairs, same floral centerpiece her mother swore by, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was softer. More intentional. There was no centerpiece of tension, no silent competition hiding under the roasted chicken and mashed potatoes. Just families slightly nervous trying their best. Jake helped their father set the plates. Lindsay poured water for everyone. Heather brought a lemon tart from a bakery downtown. Their mom kept fluttering between the kitchen and the dining room, not quite believing the dinner was happening. Their father cleared his throat as everyone settled in. We just wanted to say something, he began awkwardly but sincerely. For a long time, I think we let old habits decide how this family saw itself. And we missed a lot because of it. Their mother reached for Lindsay's hand. We're proud of you. Both of you. In different ways. For different reasons. And we're sorry it took us this long to say it. Jake nodded. She's right, he said, glancing at Lindsay. You've always been the one holding things together even when we didn't notice. The words settled on her shoulders like a shawl, warm, surprising, gently earned. Then, as if on cue, Edna lifted her teacup and spoke in that precise, calm voice that had always sliced through the noise without raising its volume. People often celebrate those who dream big, she said, but they forget that dreams like buildings collapse without foundation. It takes someone steady, someone quiet, someone with vision not just to dream but to build. She turned toward Lindsay and Jake. Jake, she said, you have fire. That's never been in doubt. But Lindsay, her eyes softened, you're the one who kept the flame from burning the house down. The room went still. Edna smiled. The world needs both kinds. But one must never forget the other. Jake lowered his head slightly, thoughtful. No defensiveness. Just respect. Lindsay reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. She passed it across the table to Edna. "I wanted to give you this," she said. "It's long overdue." Edna opened it gently. Inside was a photograph faded slightly at the edges. It was from years ago, a little girl with oversized glasses sitting at a cluttered dining table next to an older woman with a math textbook open between them. The girl's hand gripped a pencil. The woman's hand rested gently over hers. Both were smiling. Edna's eyes shimmered. "You were the first person who ever saw me," Lindsay said, her voice trembling just a little. "Not for what I could do for others. Not for how I made life easier by staying quiet, but for what I was. You gave me language when I didn't have it. You believed in the part of me I hadn't even discovered yet. I would have disappeared without you." She paused, her voice catching. "Thank you for keeping me visible." Edna reached across the table and placed her hand over Lindsay's nines. "You were never invisible, sweetheart," she said. "The world just had its eyes closed." Heather wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. Lindsay's mother let out a soft, shaky breath. Her father reached for the wine bottle but then seemed to forget why, his gaze fixed on the photo. After dessert, Jake wandered into the living room and returned with a dusty old photo album. "Remember this?" he asked, flipping it open. Inside were snapshots of birthday parties, school concerts, half-finished science projects on kitchen counters. But as they turned the pages together, something unexpected happened. They laughed. Really laughed. Not the tense, polite kind that covered discomfort, but the kind that came from mutual memory and time softening the sharp edges of old hurt. Lindsay pointed to a picture of Jake dressed as a robot made of cereal boxes and aluminum foil. "God, you really thought that was going to get you into space." "It almost did," he smirked. "NASA just wasn't ready." The evening drifted into night. As they all stood to leave, Edna lingered in the hallway with Lindsay, her hand resting lightly on her arm. "Tonight felt different," she said quietly. "Like the family finally found its new shape." Lindsay nodded. "It's still forming. But yes." Edna leaned in, whispered gently. "You didn't just build your own light, darling. You helped others find theirs." Lindsay's throat tightened again, and all she could do was hug the woman who had seen her first and best. That night, alone in her apartment, Lindsay placed the same photo of her and Edna on her desk. She looked around at the pieces of her life now visible: photos of her team, a framed article from a tech journal naming her one of the most influential women in enterprise innovation, a thank you note from one of her mentees. She had once believed that success meant being louder, more dramatic, more like Jake, but she had forged another way. A quieter way. A way that didn't shout but still resonated. And now finally they were listening. The ballroom buzzed with a low current of anticipation. It was the annual Tech and Strategy Futures Conference, an event that drew founders, analysts, investors, and curious journalists from across the country. But this year's program had a twist, a closing talk titled "Beyond the Binary Innovation Business and the Family Factor." The speakers, Jake and Lindsay. Lindsay had hesitated when first approached. The idea of standing on stage next to her brother, talking not just about industry but about their history, felt exposed. Risky. But Jake had been the first to say yes. "If we're going to talk about systems and strategy," he told her, "we should talk about the systems inside families too. The ones we never question." That was how they ended up standing together under the glow of the auditorium lights, wearing twin clip mics as their faces appeared on a pair of massive screens behind them. Jake opened with a joke. Something about failing his first pitch to a room full of VCs but somehow managing to impress his sister, a much harder sell. The crowd chuckled and the ice cracked. Lindsay followed with a story not about code or KPIs, but about the first time she sat through a family dinner and realized her voice wasn't missing, it had been ignored. And what it took to stop shrinking herself to fit old expectations. They spoke not just about tech but about trust. Not just about business models but about bias, the kind that shows up in families and boardrooms, in how we define leadership. Jake admitted candidly that the best thing that ever happened to his company was being told you don't know everything. Lindsay shared how strategic empathy, the ability to read not just numbers but people, had shaped every deal she'd made. When they finished, the audience rose to their feet. Not for the data, not for the industry insights, but because they had told the truth and done it together. After the panel, a young woman approached Lindsay in the hallway. She looked maybe 25 with a startup badge clipped to her blazer and eyes full of something familiar, hunger and hesitation. "I just wanted to say," she began nervously, "thank you for showing that there's more than one way to lead. That you don't have to be the loudest person in the room." Lindsay smiled. "You just have to know when to speak. And what matters enough to say." The woman nodded, and Lindsay watched her walk away lighter, maybe as if something had just been granted permission to grow. Later that evening, back in her apartment, Lindsay kicked off her heels and stood in front of the hallway mirror. The same mirror she had passed 1,000 times. But tonight it reflected something new. She saw a woman who no longer edited herself before she spoke. Who didn't ask for space, she took it with grace. Her reflection stood straight, unburdened. No longer the quiet sister or the support act. Just Lindsay. Whole. Visible. Enough. She thought about Jake, about how far he'd come. About the way he now sent her drafts before he shared them with leadership, asking her opinion, listening. About how he had learned to say "I don't know" without shrinking. About how their parents had started asking real questions at dinner. And about how Edna, when they called her that morning, had simply said, "I knew you two would get here." The long road always reveals the best view. On her desk was a framed version of the old photo, the one of her and Edna at the dining table. Next to it, a newer picture, Jake and Lindsay on stage, laughing under the spotlight. Neither of them had chased, but both had finally learned how to stand in. Lindsay reached for her notebook. Not the work one, the other one. The one where she wrote things she didn't want to forget. She opened to a blank page and wrote, "You don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to choose the right moment to stand up." She underlined it, twice. Outside, the city was humming. Lights flickered across windows like constellations reshaped for human hands. Somewhere down the block, a child laughed. A dog barked. The world always moving. And Lindsay, for the first time in years, felt perfectly still inside herself. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing needed to be hidden anymore. Not her mind, not her strength, not her voice. Tomorrow, she'd be back in meetings, in strategy reviews, in decision rooms. She'd have to navigate bias, interruptions, assumptions. She always would. But now she carried something different into those spaces, not just competence but confidence. Not just insight but voice. And that voice didn't have to be loud, it just had to be honest. And she was ready.